The men laughed when the truck pulled away, their voices cracking like dry wood in the Wyoming cold. Dust hung in the air, slow and cruel, as if it wanted to witness what they had done. Caleb Harlan stood at the edge of his ranch road, one hand wrapped around a fence post, watching the red taillights vanish. He already knew this wasn't a mistake. He had known the moment he saw her step down from the truck, her dress too thin for the wind, her suitcase held like a shield against a world that had already decided she was a joke. They had told him she was too fat, said it with grins sharp enough to cut bone, said no one else wanted her, said this was what a lonely rancher deserved. Caleb didn't laugh. She stood there now, unsure where to look, cheeks flushed from cold and shame. Her name, he later learned, was Maylin, though she spoke it softly, as if afraid it might offend him too. Her body was fuller than the women in magazines nailed up at the feed store, fuller than the women who had rejected him over the years, but her eyes held something else, entirely fear, dignity, and a quiet endurance that made Caleb's chest tighten. He had lived alone for 11 years since his parents died, the ranch swallowing his days and nights whole. Loneliness had become a second skin, but this cruelty dressed up as charity burned hotter than any solitude he had known. "Come inside," he said at last, voice rough but steady. She blinked, clearly expecting ridicule. Instead, she nodded. The house smelled of coffee and pine. He offered her soup without comment. She ate like someone who hadn't been allowed to feel safe in a long time. And in that moment, Caleb made a decision that would cost him everything, or save them both. No matter what joke they thought they'd played, she would never be treated like one here. The town noticed immediately. When Caleb brought Maylin into Carter's general store, conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes slid toward her body, lingered too long, then flicked to Caleb with smirks barely hidden. Someone muttered something about charity cases. Someone else laughed. Caleb felt something old and violent stir in his chest. Maylin pretended not to hear. She always did. Years of being sold, judged, weighed, and discarded had taught her silence was safer. But Caleb noticed how her shoulders curled inward, how her hands clenched at her sides. That night she tried to thank him, tried to offer herself as repayment, not with desire but with resignation. He stopped her with a single raised hand. "You don't owe me your body," he said. "You don't owe me anything." She stared at him, stunned, as if he'd spoken a language she'd never heard before. Days passed, then weeks. Maylin cooked, cleaned, learned the rhythms of the ranch. Caleb taught her how to ride, how to read the weather, how to stand her ground with animals larger than fear itself. Slowly, she began to laugh, soft at first, like a secret. At night, Caleb lay awake fighting a war, inside himself. He wanted her, not just physically but wholly, and that terrified him more than loneliness ever had. Because loving her meant standing against the world that had broken her. The cruelty didn't stop. A letter arrived one morning, anonymous, venomous. Words scrawled in ink accusing Caleb of desperation, of buying what no one else wanted. The final line was meant to wound him, but it landed somewhere else entirely. "She'll never really belong here." Caleb burned the letter in the stove. Then he went outside, found Maylin hanging laundry beneath a sky wide enough to swallow doubt. "They're wrong," he said. She looked at him confused. "You belong here," he continued. "With me if you want." Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with something stronger. Hope, fragile and dangerous. For the first time in her life, someone wasn't asking what she could endure. They were asking what she wanted. Chapter 2. Part 1. Winter came hard and early. A storm trapped them inside for 3 days. Wind howling like an accusation against the walls. They shared stories by firelight. Maylin spoke of factories, of brokers who measured her worth in pounds and silence. Caleb spoke of graves dug by hand and a house too quiet for grief. Something shifted. When she reached for his hand, it wasn't out of fear or obligation. It was choice. Caleb kissed her slowly, reverently, as if afraid she might vanish. There was no urgency, no taking, only recognition. 2 wounded lives pressing gently together, discovering that warmth didn't have to hurt. Part 2. The town tried again to break them. At the winter fair, whispers followed them like smoke. A man openly mocked her. Laughter erupted. Caleb didn't swing his fist. He did something far more dangerous. He wrapped his arm around Mei Lin's waist and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is my wife, and she is the best thing that ever happened to me." The laughter died. Mei Lin stood taller than she ever had in her life. That night she cried, not from shame, but from the shock of being chosen publicly, fiercely, without apology. Part 3. Years later, the ranch flourished. So did they. Children ran through fields once silent. Mei Lin's laughter rang through a home built not on jokes or cruelty, but devotion. Caleb still remembered the day they tried to humiliate him. He thanked God for their mistake, because they hadn't sold him a burden. They had given him his world. The past never disappeared quietly. It waited, patient and sharp, for the moment when happiness grew loud enough to offend it. Caleb sensed it first in the stillness that crept over the ranch. One late summer morning, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears instead of soothing them. Mei Lin was inside, humming as she kneaded dough, her voice warm and steady, filling the house with the sound of belonging. Caleb stood on the porch watching the horizon, hand shading his eyes, when the dust rose again on the old road, the same road that had once delivered cruelty disguised as laughter. This time the truck didn't speed away. It slowed, it stopped, and from it stepped men who had never intended to return kindness to this land. Caleb's jaw tightened. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The ranch had taught him that some storms were faced standing still. The men approached with false smiles and familiar contempt, talking too loudly, glancing past him toward the house as if Mei Lin was still an object to be appraised, not a woman who had rebuilt herself brick by brick. They spoke of mistakes, of business, of unfinished arrangements, their words coated in grease and entitlement. One of them laughed and said it again, the word that had once been used like a weapon, too fat, as if time had not passed, as if love had not rewritten every inch of her story. Caleb felt heat rise behind his ribs, but he remembered the promise he had made, not just to protect Mei Lin from harm, but from humiliation. He told them to leave calmly, clearly. When they didn't, when one of them stepped forward and suggested she still owed them for what they had done, Caleb finally understood that cruelty doesn't regret, it resents. Mei Lin appeared in the doorway then, flower on her hands, eyes steady, posture unbowed. She heard enough, she saw everything, and in that moment the power shifted. She walked to Caleb's side and took his hand, not hiding, not shrinking. The men faltered. They had expected shame. They found steel. Mei Lin spoke, her voice quiet but unbreakable, telling them she was no longer for sale, no longer measured, no longer silent. She named what they had done. She named what she had become. And as the wind moved through the grass and the ranch stood witness, Caleb realized something deeper than triumph. The woman they had tried to ruin was now the strongest force on his land. And whatever they came to take, they would leave with nothing, because she had already taken back her life. The men did not leave immediately. Shame rarely knows when it is lost. They lingered at the edge of the yard, muttering half-threats wrapped in excuses, pretending the past was negotiable. Caleb stood between them and the house, his body a quiet warning. But it was Mei Lin who truly held the ground. She did not shout. She did not plead. She simply told the truth. And truth, when spoken without fear, has a way of stripping power from those who live by lies. She spoke of contracts signed under duress, of promises never honored, of being weighed like livestock and discarded when profit thinned. Each word landed clean and final. The men shifted, eyes darting, their laughter gone, replaced by something close to panic. They realized too late that the woman before them was no longer isolated. She had a witness. She had a home. And most dangerous of all, she had nothing left to lose. One of them tried to reclaim control by turning to Caleb, suggesting money could still fix things, that a rancher's silence could be bought. Caleb answered by opening the gate and pointing to the road. His voice was calm, almost gentle, when he told them that if they returned, the sheriff would be waiting, and so would the truth. The word truth hit harder than any threat. They climbed back into the truck without another joke, without another look. Their defeat sealed not by force, but by exposure. When the engine noise faded, Mei Lin's strength finally trembled. Caleb caught her before it showed, pulling her close, not to shelter her, but to honor her. She rested her forehead against his chest, breathing in the steady rhythm of a man who had never once asked her to be smaller. The house felt different after that, lighter, as if a door long shut had finally been opened. That night, as the sun bled into the hills and the ranch settled into quiet, Mei Lin sat at the table and began to write. Not letters of apology, not petitions for mercy, but her story. Every detail, every name. She wrote until her hand ached, until the past was no longer a weight inside her but a record outside herself. Caleb watched from the doorway, knowing without doubt that this was not an ending, it was a reckoning. And reckonings once begun do not stop until justice has been named. The reckoning did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It came slowly, the way real justice often does, through persistence, through truth, carried farther than fear ever could. Mei Lin's words found their way beyond the ranch, passed from careful hands to officials who had learned, too late to recognize patterns of silence. Questions were asked, files reopened. Names once spoken only in whispers began to surface in daylight. The men who had laughed years ago now avoided mirrors, then towns, then each other, and through it all, Mei Lin did not watch with bitterness. She had already won something far greater than revenge. She had claimed her voice. On the ranch, life continued, richer and steadier than before. Caleb rose each morning beside a woman who no longer doubted her worth. And together they built not just a business, but a refuge. People came, some seeking work, others safety, and Mei Lin greeted them all with the understanding of someone who knew what it meant to arrive with nothing but hope and be given dignity instead of judgment. Seasons turned. The land grew generous under careful hands. Children learned that strength could look like softness, that love did not demand shrinking. On a quiet evening, years after the joke that was meant to destroy them, Caleb and Mei Lin stood beneath a sky wide with stars, the same sky that had once witnessed her arrival in shame. Caleb took her hand, rough and familiar, and thanked her, not for staying, not for enduring, but for choosing him when the world had offered her cruelty. She smiled, full and unafraid, and told him she had never been rescued. She had been recognized. And in that simple truth lived the story no one could ever sell, mock or take away again. Peace, Caleb learned, was not the absence of danger. It was the decision to live fully, even when danger had once been your teacher. The ranch settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than borrowed. Mornings opening with the lowing of cattle and the smell of bread rising from the oven. Evenings closing with the sound of Mei Lin's laughter drifting across the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. Yet beneath that peace, something else was growing, subtle and insistent, like roots pushing deeper into soil that had finally been cleared of stones. Mei Lin was changing again, not in the way she had when fear first fell away, but in a way that carried intention. She walked through the ranch with a new kind of attention, noticing who arrived tired and who left lighter, who avoided eye contact and who lingered as if reluctant to return to a world that still measured people too quickly. Caleb watched her quietly, recognizing the look in her eyes. It was the same look he had worn the first time he realized the ranch could be more than survival. It could be purpose. One afternoon, she asked him to walk the far pasture with her, the one that sloped gently toward the creek and caught the last of the light. She spoke slowly, choosing her words not from fear, but from care, telling him she wanted to build something there, not another barn, not more profit, but a place for women who had been brought to this country under false promises, women who had learned silence the way others learned language. She did not frame it as charity. She framed it as continuity, as an extension of what the ranch had already given her. Caleb felt the weight of the idea settle into his chest, heavy and right. He did not hesitate. He told her they would do it together. The decision seemed to wake the land itself. Word spread quietly at first, carried by those who had learned to trust the ranch as a place where dignity was not a transaction. Women arrived with suitcases smaller than their histories, eyes wary but searching. Maylin met each of them at the gate, never asking for explanations, never offering pity. She offered work, safety, and choice. Caleb watched her become something the world had never allowed her to be before, a leader who did not command but invited, whose strength came not from hardening, but from having survived softness intact. The town, predictably, reacted in pieces. Some praised them, eager to claim moral ground now that the danger had passed. Others warned Caleb he was inviting trouble, that people like Maylin once had a way of bringing chaos wherever they settled. Caleb listened without argument. He had long ago learned that conviction did not need defense. Trouble did come, but not in the form the town expected. It came quietly, through old laws poorly enforced and new scrutiny that arrived masked as concern. Officials visited. Questions were asked again, this time about zoning, about permits, about whether a ranch could legally shelter those with complicated histories. Caleb answered every question plainly. Maylin stood beside him through every inspection, her presence steady, her voice clear. Each challenge sharpened their resolve rather than weakening it. At night, when the house finally slept, Caleb sometimes woke to find Maylin sitting at the table, papers spread before her, planning with a focus that was almost reverent. He would stand behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders, feeling the solidity of a woman who had once been described as too much, and was now precisely enough. She told him she was not trying to erase the past, she was building a future, where it no longer got the final word. Caleb understood then that love, real love, did not end with healing. It moved outward. It demanded witnesses. And as the ranch lights burned late into the night and the far pasture slowly transformed into something new, he of their lives was not about survival or defiance, it was about legacy and the quiet, unbreakable courage of choosing to matter.